Last time we talked about early childhood development as it related to physical development and brain development. This time we're going to be talking about psychosocial development in early childhood. And the first thing that we'll talk about, and we've mentioned this before, is that emotional development continues to take place, and specifically we see further elaboration of emotional regulation abilities. That's again the ability to control when and how emotions are expressed, and this is most likely due to the increase in development of the prefrontal cortex, and specifically those connections between the prefrontal cortex, which we mentioned is important in inhibiting behavior, keeping us from being able to do from doing things that we would probably like to do but choose not to do. So it's those developments between the connections of the prefrontal cortex with the limbic system that are most likely the biological basis for this increased emotional regulation that we see throughout early childhood and on into older childhood years. Erickson, he talked about the stage of initiative versus guilt. This was Erickson's third psychosocial stage of development, where there was a crisis between a child's ability to initiate their behavior and any resultant guilt that they might experience if they either fail to initiate their behavior or if they engage in behaviors that are considered by the society that a child finds himself or herself in to be unacceptable. So here, children are undertaking new skills and activities, and they sometimes feel this newfound emotion of guilt when they do not succeed at them. And guilt is a relatively new emotion that develops. It's not present at birth because it necessitates at least some understanding and awareness of other people's expectations of behavior. And so again, we talked previously about how our ability to think about what other people think, which is in part what allows us to feel the emotion of guilt, develops from first our ability to think about ourself. So here, the child's self continues to develop. And when we talk about self, we mean their general awareness of themselves. And we could specifically talk about self esteem, which is a person's evaluation of his or her own worth, either in terms of specific things like intelligence or attractiveness, or just self esteem more generally, not as applied to a specific trait, but just overall how one feels about themselves. Um, and then there's the self concept. This is a person's understanding of who he or she is, incorporating self esteem, physical appearance, personality, and various personal traits, including such things as gender and size. So this is a much more general concept, the self concept, and it's really very generally how we think about ourselves, how we view ourselves. And we, interestingly enough, see that the self-concept in early childhood is not quite as accurate as it will become later on. In fact, preschoolers often are overly optimistic, and this is what's referred to as a protective optimism, because it's probably in part protecting them from the potential negative effects of failures that they may experience as they are developing new behaviors. So one example of this is that preschoolers will often predict that they can solve impossible puzzles, that they can remember long lists of words, and that they can control their dreams. And again, this may be present because it helps them to try out new things and makes them less hesitant to try new things because they're not as concerned about failure as older children might be. So again, guilt and shame, these are relatively new emotions. The difference between them is that guilt is seen more as a self-blame that people experience when they do something wrong, whereas shame is generally people's feelings that others blame them or disapprove of them or are disappointed in them. And these are really much more social emotions than something like happiness or sadness, which could really be experienced independently of what's going on around them or how other people view one another. Um, Oftentimes, motivation is discussed in terms of emotion because typically they go hand in hand. That is, things that we are motivated by often involve some sort of emotion. And there are two relatively distinct types of motivation that we could talk about. Intrinsic motivation is a drive or reason to pursue a goal that seems to come from inside a person, such as a need to feel smart or competent. So, really, intrinsic motivation is motivation in which a person is doing something more so just for the sake of doing it, um, rather than for some external incentive. And that's what extrinsic motivation really refers to. This is a drive or reason to pursue a goal that arises more so from the need to have one's achievements rewarded from outside, for example, by receiving material possessions or another person's esteem. So, again, perhaps, a child who, likes playing a particular game because they like it, that's intrinsic motivation. Although a child who likes playing a game because they see that they get attention from somebody for playing that game, that's considered to be more of an extrinsic form of motivation. And there's some impact of culture on the types of motives and goals that we see. For instance, in the United States, there's more of an emphasis on overcoming fears. In Puerto Rico, there's an emphasis on modifying anger. In China, it's more emphasized to temper pride. In Japan, controlling aggression, and in Native American communities, we see a greater emphasis on the need to be patient and cooperative. So, emotion regulation is impacted to some extent by culture. That's in addition to the biological functions that we mentioned at the beginning, which are subserved by the connections between prefrontal and limbic system areas of our brain. Um, Lack of emotional regulation can be a sign of early psychopathology, that is, psychological disorder. Pathology meaning disordered psyche, essentially. And sometimes researchers in the field of developmental psychopathology break down the types of problems that people experience into external and internalizing problems. Externalizing problems typically involve expressing powerful feelings through uncontrolled physical or verbal outbursts, for example, lashing out at people or breaking things. So, aggression would be considered an externalizing problem. Internalizing problems, on the other hand, typically involve turning one's emotional distress inward by feeling things like excessive guilt, feeling ashamed, or feeling worthless. So, whereas aggression would be seen as more of an externalizing type of problem, depression would be seen as more of an internalizing problem. And again, that's because one's emotional distress is being turned inward as opposed to outward. That's kind of what the distinction is between those two types of problems. We see some sex differences as well in emotion regulation. Um, Boys tend to be more aggressive, and so they tend to be more likely to have externalizing uh, types of problems, whereas girls they tend to have more internalizing types of problems, so they tend to be a bit more anxious. Um, and this is a very complex question to try to answer. To what extent are these due to biological differences between males and females, things like hormones or brain development, as opposed to the uh, social factors that are associated with being either a boy or a girl? But either way we look at it, psychopathology is not typical, and children of both sexes usually learn to regulate their emotions as their brains mature and their parents nurture them. Play is a very important and productive, enjoyable activity that children undertake. It's important in terms of developing social skills and learning about the world. So play is quite different to a child than it is to an adult. Typically, play for an adult is meant for or an older child anyway, is meant more so for relaxation purposes, whereas play for children, that's both there's no distinction really between play and work because they're serving essentially the same purpose. And play has been shown to be universal. It's not something that just exists in one culture or another. And of course, it also exists in a variety of different mammalian species as well. Archaeologists have found toys that are thousands of years old, so it's not a new development. And anthropologists again have found that they see play taking place in just about every part of the world. Although the form of play will change with both age and culture, it'll become more complex. Social play, as the brain matures, um, coupled with many hours of social play. So social play probably has an influence on brain maturation, and then of course brain maturation will permit more complex types of social play to take place. And children really, when they're playing, they need to learn how to make and keep friends too. So that's the socialization aspect of play. Um, Peers, these are children will play with both their peers and their parents, although at some point they tend to show greater preference to begin playing with peers as opposed to parents. And peers are, of course, people of about the same age and social status. They provide practice in things like emotional regulation and empathy and social understanding. And again, children will begin to prefer to play with each other rather than with their parents as they get older. Interestingly, some different types of play have been recognized for many years now, going back to 1932. There's solitary play, in which a child plays alone, unaware of other children playing nearby, and you could look at this as a progressive type of play. So um, the youngest children will engage more in solitary play, whereas older children will go through these different forms of play, and only the oldest children would be engaging in a type of cooperative play. Onlooker play, here a child watches other children play. Parallel play, children will play with similar toys in similar ways, but not together. So the key difference between parallel play and associative play is that um, they are playing near one another, but not necessarily with one another. Here in associative play, children interact and they observe each other and they share material, but their play is not yet completely mutual and reciprocal. It's not until you start to see this cooperative play where children will play together, creating and elaborating a joint activity or taking turns. Active play, this is a rough and tumble type of play that typically mimics aggression through things like wrestling, chasing, or hitting. But although it's important to recognize that this is without the intent to actually cause harm to another child. Expressions and gestures signify that a child is just pretending. It's particularly common among males. There's ample space, distance from adults, and presence of friends will increase the likelihood of engaging in active play. Okay, sort of like when mom turns her head, that's when you can start to engage in this more active type of play, type of thing. You see advances in children's social understanding, but increases also in the likelihood of injury occur with active play. And this again may also positively affect prefrontal cortex development by engaging in this type of play because it involves a certain form of imagination, which is considered to be a higher order type of thinking, going above and beyond just what's actually going on and thinking about, if we pretend that this is going on sort of thing. So here's an example of the typical type of active play that you might see among boys. There's also socio-dramatic play, which is pretend play in which children act out various roles and themes in stories that they create. And this could almost be considered a bit more of a cognitively sophisticated type of play. It enables children to explore and rehearse social roles enacted around them, to test their ability to explain and convince playmates of their ideas, practice regulating their emotions by pretending to be afraid, angry, brave, and so on, and develop a self-concept in really a non-threatening context, because this is, after all, a form of play. And so, this would be an example of more the socio-dramatic type of play. Diana Baumrind, she had identified, as you can see in the late 1960s, different types of parenting styles that parents seem to engage in. And she found that the parents, they differ in four important dimensions. One is their expression of warmth. They vary from very affectionate to cold and critical. Two, the strategies that they use for discipline. So some parents, they vary in whether they explain, criticize, persuade, ignore, or punish children for their behavior. They differ in their communication. Some parents will listen patiently to their children, and others will demand silence. And the fourth dimension that she found great variability was in their expectations for maturity. Parents vary in their standards that they set for children regarding responsibility and self-control. So here are the four parenting styles that Baumrind had explored, or had found, I should say, based on her observations of parents. Authoritarian parenting. This is a type of parenting in which there are high behavioral standards, strict punishment of misconduct, and little communication. This is not the ideal form of parenting. Neither is permissive parenting. This is where you have high nurturance and communication, but little discipline, guidance, and control. And as we'll see in a minute, these different parenting styles tend to have different types of effects, as we might expect, on the way that children develop. Authoritative parenting. This is probably we could say that this is the most preferable type of parenting, only because it seems to have the best outcomes in children's behavior associated with it. Here, parents set limits and enforce rules, but are still flexible and listen to their children. And the fourth type is neglectful or uninvolved parenting, and these are parents who are typically indifferent toward their children, and to a large extent unaware of what's going on in their children's lives. So this table is in the textbook. It's a little bit difficult to see on here, perhaps, but what we see here is the different parenting styles: authoritarian, permissive, and authoritative, and how they vary on the dimensions of warmth, discipline, expectations of maturity, and communication, both going from parent to child and child to parent. So again, authoritative. This is typically the type of parenting style that has the best outcomes associated with it. Here, warmth is high, discipline is moderate, with much discussion. That is, you don't just discipline a child. You tell them, why is it not okay to do that. They have moderate expectations of maturity, and there's high communication both from parent to child and from child to parent. So as I said, children of authoritarian parents, they tend to develop differently than the other types. They specifically become conscientious, obedient, and quiet, but not especially happy. They tend to feel guilty or depressed a little bit more often than children from the other parenting styles, and they tend to blame themselves when things don't go well. They have a slightly higher likelihood of rebelling as adolescents and are more likely to leave home before age 20. Children of permissive parents tend to, and let me again just emphasize this, tend to. Of course, these not all parents will fit very neatly into any of these particular styles, and even if a parent does fit in neatly in a particular style, there's of course no guarantee that a child is going to turn out one way or another. Same as we talked about with attachment, that although secure attachment is seen as being the ideal form of attachment, it's not to say that that's going to prevent any adverse outcomes from occurring. So children of permissive parents tend to be more unhappy and lack self-control, especially in their peer relationships. This is probably in part due to somewhat of a lack of discipline. They tend to suffer from inadequate emotional regulation. They are a little bit more immature and tend to lack friendships, which has been proposed to be the reason behind their unhappiness. And they continue to live at home and still dependent in early adulthood. They don't move out quite as early. So children of authoritative parents, they tend to be successful, articulate, happy with themselves, and generous with others. And they also tend to be well liked by teachers and peers, especially in societies in which individual initiative is valued, which is probably the case in many places in our society in the U.S. Of course, there are certainly a number of critiques about Baumann's model. Her original sample had little economic, ethnic, or cultural diversity, so there's certainly the question of how well the results of her findings will actually generalize outside of that specific economic, ethnic, and cultural group that was studied. She tended to focus more on the attitudes than on daily interactions. Some authoritarian parents are, of course, very loving toward their children. Some permissive parents guide their children intensely, but with words, not with rules. So Baumann may have classified some parents as being permissive uh, be, because she wasn't taking into account the fact that they would tend to use more words rather than behaviors to show the discipline. And she also overlooked the children's contribution to parent-child relationship. Of course, it's not just uh, the parents behaving in a vacuum. Their parents will behave and react to a child's behavior. Um, Children, parents, and the media. They, of course, as TV became more and more popular, you tended to see more and more hours of a child's time being devoted to watching television. So, as we can see from this table here, we see that the average 2 to 4 year old probably watches somewhere around 3.5 to 4 hours, with perhaps a little bit of cultural variability or ethnic variability there. But about 3.5 to 4 hours from 2 to 4, and from 5 to 7, it's roughly the same, still about 3.5 to 4 hours or so. So that's a good chunk of the day right there. So what are the implications of this of these TV watching habits? Well, of course, the most well-researched finding is the relationship between violence on TV and aggression in children. Violence on TV is often depicted as morally acceptable, so the number one concern is, does that translate into children learning that violence is acceptable too? There have been a number of studies that find that children who watch televised violence become more violent themselves. Now, please do keep in mind here that, of course, correlation does not imply causation. So just because children who watched televised violence does not mean that that's the cause of them being violent. It could, of course, be that if I'm a violent person, I might show a preference toward watching violence on television. Or, of course, it could be that I got violent genes from my parents who tend to put violent type of television programs on for me. So it's very difficult to tell the exact nature of that relationship. It's largely correlational, although there is some evidence to suggest that that it does certainly increase the likelihood of children engaging in aggressive behavior. Racial and gender stereotypes are still evident in children's programs, and educational television likely has positive effects. There's certainly a lot of educational television shows out there, and these probably have positive effects. Experts recommend that parents, of course, do limit their children's television viewing and spend more time talking and playing rather than just putting on a television. In terms of moral development, we see the development of empathy. Empathy is really a type or a subset of theory of mind ability. It's the ability to understand the emotions and concerns of another person, especially when they differ from one's own. So oftentimes empathy is confused with sympathy, Empathy is when I actually feel sad when I see that something bad has happened to you, which made you sad. Sympathy is more of I understand that you feel sad, but I don't necessarily feel sad myself. So it's really that feeling of another person's emotions. Uh, Antipathy, that's sort of not exactly the opposite of empathy, but it does relate to how we feel about other people. And antipathy is characterized by feelings of dislike or even hatred sometimes for another person. Um, Pro-social behavior, these are actions that are helpful and kind but are of no obvious benefit to the person doing them. And pro-social behaviors, these are kind of altruistic behavior. You may have heard of that term before. That's altruism is a form of pro-social behavior. This tends to increase from ages 3 to 6, whereas antisocial behavior starts to decline around that time. Antisocial behavior being actions that are deliberately hurtful or destructive to another person. And one type of course, of antisocial behavior is aggression, and there are different types of aggression. Instrumental aggression is hurtful behavior that's intended to get something that another person has in order to keep it. So the instrumental here refers to there's a goal behind engaging in the aggressive behavior, and that goal is typically to get something. Reactive aggression, on the other hand, is more of an impulsive retaliation for another person's intentional or accidental action, which could be, of course, verbal or physical. So if somebody hits you, you just sort of impulsively hit them back or impulsively yell at them because, of course, if somebody hit you, it may have been a mistake. Relational aggression, these are non-physical acts such as insults or social rejection. They're aimed at harming the social connection between the victim and other people. And some research suggests that females are more likely to use the relational form of aggression. Males are more likely to use non-relational or perhaps instrumental aggression. Bullying aggression, this is unprovoked, repeated physical or verbal attack, especially on victims who are unlikely to defend themselves. And of course, this is a big concern for educators and parents and adults because we'd certainly like to be able to eliminate entirely bullying aggression. So when we discipline or when we think about discipline, we really need to take into consideration children's thinking abilities. Remember theory of mind. Young children gradually come to understand things from their own viewpoints, and you can't discipline them in a manner that would presuppose that they understand other people's viewpoints before they're actually cognitively or developmentally able to do so. Remember their emerging concept. When the sense of self is developing, sharing becomes more difficult. So when I start to realize that, hey, this is mine, it becomes more difficult for me to give that up. Remember fast mapping, that younger children are eager to talk and think, but they often say more than they really understand. And so explanations and discussion before and after misbehavior help children learn are important. And of course, remember that young children are not always logical. Children may disconnect a misdeed from the punishment. And if they don't understand that I'm being specifically punished for what I just did, then punishment will have no effect on that behavior. Physical punishment. Some researchers believe that physical punishment is harmless, others don't. Physical punishment increases obedience temporarily, that's for sure, but it increases the possibility of later aggression, which is, of course, a good reason that researchers do not think that physical punishment should be used. Many children who are spanked do not become violent adults. Other factors, for example, poverty and temperament, are much stronger influences. So it may it may serve as a risk factor, but it's not it's not the number one factor that's going to determine are you going to become a violent adult. Were you physically punished as a child? Other forms of punishment other than physical punishment include psychological control. This is a disciplinary technique that involves threatening to withdraw love or support, and it relies on a child's feelings of guilt and gratitude to the parents. Um, and another option is the timeout. This is a disciplinary technique in which a child is separated from other people and activities for a specified time, and uh, the most effective time is as a very short period of time. It's not as if you just leave a child alone for a number of hours. Um, so around age 2, children begin to identify boys and girls and apply gender labels consistently. Around age 4, children are convinced that certain toys, such as dolls or trucks, are appropriate for one gender but not for the other. And this goes for clothing as well. I remember specifically my nephew. I remember asking him about whether some character that I had seen um, that was one of his playthings was a boy or a girl. I think it was a stuffed animal actually, and I remember him saying that it was a girl because it had pink on, and that was his reasoning for why it was a girl when otherwise you couldn't tell other than the clothing which one it would have been. Sex differences and gender differences reflect two different things. Sex differences refer to biological differences between males and females in organs, hormones, and body shape. So this is really a question of, do you have an XX or an XY in your 23rd pair of chromosomes? Gender differences are differences in the roles and behaviors that are prescribed by a culture for males and females. So there's nothing inherently biologically uh, predisposing females to choose pink and males to choose blue. That's really something that's been prescribed by culture. Uh, and there's initial confusion about gender and sex, but by age 5, there's an increased awareness of sex and gender differences, and by age 8, the belief that their biological sex is they come to recognize that their biological sex is a permanent trait, and that just switching shirts doesn't convert you from a boy to a girl, for instance. They also have an increased awareness of sex differences. Preferences for same-sex playmates start to emerge, and they tend to engage in stereotypical gender activities, more so between the ages of 2 and 8. They progressively develop those things, that is. Regarding the theories of gender differences, of course, the most famous one is probably Freud's psychoanalytic theory. He talked about the phallic stage as being the third stage of psychosexual development, when the penis becomes the focus of concern and pleasure. And then he talked about the Oedipal complex or Oedipus complex. This is the unconscious desire that young boys have to replace their fathers and win their mother's exclusive love. And of course, this is a very controversial theory and not very well backed by research, although there are certainly some interesting anecdotal reports and evidence that people are quick to come up with that sort of make this theory make sense to them in light of what their experiences are at times. And there's a good example of this in the textbook that illustrates this anecdotal evidence. And anecdotal evidence is just sort of this one-time isolated event. It seems to support to some extent this theory. The superego in psychoanalytic theory, this is the judgmental part of the personality that internalizes the moral standards of the parents. So of course, thanks to the superego, Freud said that boys come to the recognition that, of course, they can't replace their father. And instead, they come to identify with him. So the identification, this is an attempt to defend one's self-concept by taking on the behaviors and attitudes of someone else. Whereas the boys, he said, experience the Oedipus complex, he said that girls develop an electric complex, which is an unconscious desire for girls to replace their mothers and win their father's exclusive love. Again, the research supporting that theory is almost non-existent. On the other hand, behaviorism, they also have there's the behavioral theory behind the development of gender differences, and this of course comes from ongoing reinforcement and punishment. So gender appropriate behavior is rewarded more frequently than gender inappropriate behavior. So if my nephew put on a pink shirt, he would likely not be reinforced for that choice. But if he chose a blue shirt, for instance, his mother and father and probably myself would be much more likely to reinforce them, and so that's in part the way that that behaviorists explain these gender differences. Social learning theory: children also notice the ways that men and women behave and internalize the standards they observe. So, if he never sees me wearing a pink shirt, he may internalize that. Well, Tom is my uncle. He's a boy. He doesn't wear pink shirts. He wears blue shirts. So I should wear blue shirts too. And then, according to cognitive theory, a child's concept or general belief about sex differences, which is based on his or her observations or experiences, of course, not unlike social learning theory. So young children categorize themselves and everyone else is either male or female, and then think and behave accordingly. And then, of course, systems theory offers the most complex and comprehensive explanation for gender differences, that genes, culture, parents and peers, ideas and customs all interact, affecting each child in order to develop their concept of what what gender actually means. And ultimately, eventually, children will develop uh, to some extent androgynously. Androgyny refers to the balance within a person of traditionally masculine and feminine psychological characteristics. And androgyny is typically seen as being more healthy than the opposite of being all one way or the other.